Eddie tried to make the best of a bad situation. They both did, observed a Kostara family member. But Eddie had a lot of resentment in him. He felt his life was over before it had really started. Eddie's dreams were definitely shattered, and it made him a bitter and angry man through much of his life. Martha Sr. wasn't really happy either. She'd wanted to teach and not jump into marriage and have kids right away, but she was able to handle life's slings and arrows more realistically than Eddie. He always had those visions of greatness, and he possessed that inflated ego, and it always got in his way. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and we're going to keep going in Jerry Oppenheimer's book, Martha Stewart, Just Desserts. Thank you guys so much for how positive you were about the book. So many of you were really excited about it, and I loved to see how thrilled you were to read this, excited, and I'm so excited to go on this journey with you. There were a couple of comments, though, that I saw that people said, why are you going after Martha Stewart? She showed us so much. I grew up with Martha Stewart. She was, the woman of my generation. I learned a lot from her. I'm not interested in dragging her. And I just want to say this, neither am I. I want to read this book because I think it's really an interesting tale about the way you climb the ladder and the way that she went about doing things in a really sort of sometimes dishonest way. But my intention isn't to wreck everything and say, oh, everything that she laid her hand to is just trash, because it wasn't. Unlike Meghan Markle, who has this show on Netflix to teach you all these tips and tricks about the art of gracious living but can't even zest a lemon, Martha Stewart had something to sell and sold it well. She did her job amazingly well. She had so many things to teach us. And one of the things that I respect the most about Martha Stewart is the fact that she said being a homemaker is an art, it's a job, it's something to be proud of. I think that for a long time, Americans had, number one, stopped caring about what they put on their plate. And it was all just, how fast can I get dinner on the table, for all the tired housewives out there who were doing it on their own because their husbands were at the office from dawn till dark. And they had to put something on the table for Jimmy and they were sick of it. So it's like, here's a can of cream of mushroom soup. Let's just be done with it. And she said, we can do better than that, and I'll show you how, and I'll teach you why it matters, and I'll also make you proud to do it better. And instead of it just being this chore that you had to do, now it was like a hobby. Now it injected interest into the art of making your house a home. I think that she educated an entire generation who otherwise would not have known how to do the things she was showing them how to do, because they'd been raised by moms who were of a generation that said, just mix up some chicken and cream of mushroom soup and call it a day. So I just want to say that I'm reading this book because I'm interested to find out what made Martha Stewart, and I'm interested in the way that she went about life and the way that she kind of navigated her childhood and tried to take the pieces of her childhood that and sort of rework it into this empire. I think she did it dishonestly. I think that she hid who she was. I think she always kept people at arm's length, but I think that's interesting. So if you are one of the people that thought, well, I wish you hadn't read this book, or I wish you hadn't chosen this book because I like Martha Stewart. I like Martha Stewart too. I like the things that she said. I think that she gives you so many tools, and you can choose to look at those tools and be like, well, I can't be that perfect. Or you can say, well, what of this can I choose? Because I don't know exactly what to do when I host people at my house. I need sort of a organization guide. I would like to have some ideas about, new dinner ideas. I'd love some new recipes. Like, take what you want and leave the rest at the door. If her perfectionism became too much of a mantle for you to bear, then don't wear it, So anyway, I just wanted to say, I see what you're saying. Jerry Oppenheimer wrote a book about Jerry Seinfeld that I will never read because I love Jerry Seinfeld and I don't want to know anything bad about him. So I understand if at any point you think, I don't want to know anything about Martha Stewart, I can't watch anymore. I get it. But I also want you to know that I'm not doing this out of a place of ugliness or unkindness or like, let's tear down the American icons. I'm not interested in that. I just am interested, very much like Jerry Oppenheimer, what made this woman tick. So that's a long intro. Let's get into it. We are going to read today, and hopefully longer than we got a chance to read yesterday. Okay, this chapter, as you'll recall, we had 2 chapters yesterday that sort of set us up for the person that she is becoming. The first chapter really was about how her world is crumbling. At the start of the book, we're right up to date. Her husband is leaving her. her business is booming, but now her husband has left her, and many of the contracts that she had just signed, specifically one with Kmart, sort of impinged on the fact that she had what seemed like a very traditional, comfortable home where there wasn't any drama. And then her husband leaves her. Well, she's on tour for a book called Martha Stewart Weddings, which she had dedicated to him. And in that chapter, we had talked about how she had completely lost it in front of her friend Kathy Tatlock, who lived with her in her garage apartment. And she showed Kathy that she had, in complete rage, as she tried to get Andy to come back home, had torn her own hair out of her head. I suppose as a signal to him of her desperation. It didn't take. He, kept her at bay. And then the next chapter, we got a little bit about who her parents were, but that chapter largely circled around the fact that Martha Stewart used her family when she needed pieces for her magazine. And while Martha was super, super, super careful always to create this perfect image about herself and always looked to write stories and reminiscences and pieces of nostalgia about what a happy, wonderful home she had, there was a strange incident where she decided to reveal her mother's deep, dark secret that she had been pregnant when she got married, and it's pretty much why she got married. And it seems strange that Martha would say that about her mother, would throw her mother under the bus like that, when she understood the necessity of the carefully curated image because she so carefully curated her own image about what people thought of her. And it's strange that she would have revealed her mother's dark secret. How would she have felt if someone had done that to her? So, two very strange chapters. Today's episode, we're really going to be getting more into her family background, her grandparents and everything, setting up kind of where she comes from and kind of the dynamics of her home life early on. So that's going to be our focus today. This first little chapter we read, it says, "From Poland with Love. If Martha inherited her Epicurean and entrepreneurial talents, her imperial manner, and her hard-nosed business style from anyone, that person might well have been her paternal grandfather, Franz Joseph Kostyra." Sailing past the Statue of Liberty into New York Harbor in 1905, Franz Kostyra looked far different from the tired, poor, huddled masses arriving from all over Europe during that great wave of immigration. At 26, Kostyra was a man of strength, bearing, and vigor, who towered over his sickly-looking fellow travelers. When snow fell in the old country, Kostyra gleefully doffed his clothing and danced in the white stuff. Imposing at well over 6 feet, he'd served in the military honor guard of his namesake, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, a member of the ancient ruling family of Habsburg. The earliest Kostyras lived in the medieval kingdom of Poland, which was partitioned among Prussia, Russia, and Austria-Hungary in the late 18th century. When Franz Kostyra was born in 1879, the Poles under the rule of Franz Joseph fared somewhat better than those under the Prussians or Russians. The emperor adopted relatively liberal internal policies, leaving Poles some semblance of self-government, even permitting them to form their own political parties. Because of his height, equestrian talents, and the fact that the Kostyras had come from a line of warriors dating back to the Crusades, family lore tells of a crest emblazoned with broken spears and arrows, Franz Kostyra had been recruited into the emperor's honor guard and participated in many colorful parades. But young Kostyra, who had no real formal education, was determined to learn a trade that would put bread and butter on his family's table when he returned to civilian life. Volunteering for training as a cook, he found his calling. Kostyra learned everything from baking to running a mess hall. By the end of his enlistment, he knew the meat and potatoes of food preparation and restaurant management, all of which served him well when he landed in America. Kostyra, who arrived in New York with a survivor mentality, one that his granddaughter Martha would inherit, started at the bottom at Child's, a cafeteria chain that had white tile walls to emphasize cleanliness and discourage loitering. By the time he got a job behind the steam counter, Child's was starting to boom, aided in part by temperance pressure against taverns. Demonstrating ambition and drive, Kostyra, who now called himself Frank, quickly moved up the Child's food chain. Before long, he was overseeing the opening of new restaurants, developing recipes, hiring, and training kitchen workers. One night at a Polish social club, he met Helen Kruger, a pretty teenager 11 years his junior, and they fell in love and were married after a short courtship. After they had tied the knot, she got a job working in the household of a wealthy New York City family, the Oppenheimers, and the newlyweds moved into a crowded apartment building on Madison Avenue between 107th and 108th Street, where other Krukers lived. Unlike the Kostyras, the Krukers had a difficult time assimilating. Helen often recounted the story of how back in the old country, a family of storks had established a nest on the chimney of the Krukers' thatched roof cottage. The storks' decision to take up residence there, the Krukers believed, was a good sign, a lucky omen, and the family made no effort to force the birds to leave. But Helen's belief in that old wives' tale was severely shaken with the birth of her first child in America. The baby, a girl whom the parents named Stasia, was taken seriously ill and soon died. Helen was devastated. The memory of Stasia's inexplicable death haunted Helen Kostyra for the rest of her life. Despite this tragedy, she became pregnant again, and on August 21st, 1911, the apple of her eye came into the world. It was a beautiful baby with bright blue eyes and a shock of blonde curly hair. The Kostyras lovingly named him Edward Rudolph. For Helen Kostyra, Eddie's birth had reaffirmed the peasant story about the goodness of the stork. But, like Stasia's, little Eddie's health was poor. He suffered from innumerable childhood illnesses and ailments, including frequent nosebleeds that caused Helen enormous concern. Because of his problems and her memory of Stasia, Helen coddled, spoiled, and nursed the future father of Martha Stewart. Despite the fact that Helen had two more children, Estelle in 1917 and Henrik in 1922, Eddie was always her favorite. She babied him all along through his life, Henrik Hank Kostyra observed. Unlike his wife, however, Frank Kostyra was a stern taskmaster who didn't believe in coddling the boy. Grandfather would hold a lit cigarette under Dad's elbow to force him to keep his arm up when he was practicing the violin, Eric Scott offered. That was Grandfather. By 1920, at the age of 41, Frank Kostyra had been with Childs for 15 years, and the chain had plans to name him manager of its flagship restaurant on Fifth Avenue. But tired of being a working stiff, he decided to strike out on his own. That year, he moved the family across the Hudson to Jersey City, where Kostyra saw greater opportunities for himself. With the city's large Polish population and a mayor who was a benevolent despot, much like Emperor Franz Joseph, Kostyra immediately felt at home. Even Jersey cops, tough Irishmen and Poles, who were required to stand at least 6 feet tall, reminded Kostyra of the Emperor's honor guard, in which he had proudly served. Because of his expertise in the food business, Frank Kostyra decided to open a butcher shop, specializing in cut-to-order prime meats. Money to start the business wasn't a problem. Kostyra had socked away virtually every penny he had ever earned, frugality being another family trait. Dad worked hard for his money, up early in the morning and working until late at night, said Hank Kostyra. Very seldom did we have a vacation. We're all the same, all the Kostyras. We work hard, and we hold on to what we have. Kostyra paid cash for the little butcher shop at 730 Newark Avenue from a fat wad of dough with a rubber band round it that he kept in his hip pocket. He called the business Kostyra's Meats. The family moved into a 3-story apartment building 2 blocks south of the store at 3041 Hudson Boulevard and joined the local parish church, St. Anne's. The kids, Eddie, Estelle, and Hank, went to the nearby public schools, and their father joined the Society of Sons of Poland Group 3, a fraternal organization. But his most important move as a newly arrived businessman was to become allied with Mayor Haig's powerful Hudson County Democratic Association, the machine that kept the Irish Catholic political boss in power for a mind-boggling 3 decades without his ever once getting indicted for political crime or misdemeanor. Though Haig's mayoral salary was modest, he somehow managed to buy a fancy house on the Jersey Shore, enjoy a posh apartment on Manhattan's Park Avenue, and winter at his chic place in sunny Florida. And every year he took a European vacation. Dad was very active with Haig, Hank Kostyra said. They were buddy-buddy. To stay in favor, Frank Kostyra always made certain that the finest cuts of his shop's primest meats were on the mayor's dinner table, and that his campaign contribution were in Haig's pocket. Solid citizens and supporters like Kostyra, who were on the mayor's A list, were generally rewarded for such civic-mindedness and generosity. Once, when Hank Kostyra was out playing in a vacant lot, he fell on a broken bottle and required specialized treatment for the injury that could have resulted in the loss of a hand. Dad called Haig, who called the hospital, the Haig Memorial Center, and told them that I needed help, Kostyra said. Haig said, "Set him up there. We'll get him treated." I went up there, and they gave me a room and the best doctors, and we never got a bill. Haig was a good guy. Frank Costyra's Buick eventually sported a very low Hudson County license number. What is this? Dubai? I had no idea that this was an American thing. But anyway, the book says that if you had below 10, you didn't have to worry about anything. You could park anywhere without getting a ticket. Dad had tag number 8 or 9, Hank Costyra recalled. The traffic cops stood on these little pedestals in the middle of the street, and when they saw Dad's tag coming, they'd salute. When he took his car for service, he'd go next door to the precinct house and borrow a police car and use it for the rest of the day. That's the kind of deal he had with Haig. By 1925, Costyra had tired of the butcher business and sold the shop to a brother-in-law. By that time, my father also had a couple of butcher shops up in Union City, Hank Costyra said. He'd buy different businesses. He bought and sold property. Dad was a speculator. He took chances. He'd buy a business and run it himself for a while, and then he'd put it up for sale. He'd say, I'll turn it over to you, and you run it for a month or two. You see if you decide to keep it. You pay me off on it, and it's yours. Before the guy even had a chance to change his mind, my dad would get the guy's money in his hand. Frank Costyra also made a nice dollar by lending money and charging interest on the loan. Even though Costyra charged hefty rates, the borrowers thought of him as a benevolent man, because no one else would give them credit. The borrowers were working stiffs like the big black man who showed up unexpectedly one afternoon at the Costyra's front door, scaring Helen half to death, to repay a loan he had received from her husband. He didn't have me sign no papers, just a handshake, the black man told Helen Costyra when he handed her the money. Despite prohibition, Frank Costyra traded his butcher apron for a barkeep's garb and bought Billy Marks's Tavern at 153 Liberty Avenue, which he renamed Costyra's Tavern. The slogan on his business card read, "Good beer served here. All kind of best wines and liquor." It wasn't much for marketing, this guy. The names of his businesses are pretty bland and not exactly a catchy slogan, but Costyra was free to sell all the booze that he could because the mayor never seriously enforced the national law on the sale of beer, wine, and liquor. I guess we had the largest bar in Jersey City until somebody bought another place and made the bar a little longer, Hank Costyra said. The Costyras took up residence in an apartment above the tavern. The place was big enough for the two brothers, Eddie and Hank, to share a room, and for their sister Estelle to have one of her own. It was a comfortable apartment, and the family resided there for almost 2 full decades, through the Depression and most of World War II. All right, let's get a little bit more about Eddie, shall we? Because, of course, Eddie is Martha's dad, and he is a problematic character throughout the rest of this book, as long as he was alive. But what made him so? Let's read on. Eddie Costyra's family believed he was a boy genius, and he certainly had acted the part. If he was buried in a book, he was at center stage, reeling off what he knew to anyone who would listen. He appeared to be an expert on everything, though some thought of him as a bit of an oddball or a boorish braggart. Because of all the attention, especially from his mother, he grew up believing he was special, and he had the extraordinary ability to convince others of his uniqueness, a trait his daughter Martha inherited and utilized with far greater success. Usually at his mother's side, because of his early illnesses, Costyra had learned housewifery skills that most boys his age would have fled from. With enthusiasm, he took up cooking and had a flair for gardening and an eye for fashion and design. Sewing fascinated the boy, so much so that Helen Costyra's lady friends were green with envy over the way little Eddie wielded a needle and thread. The boy also was artistic and creative, with a penchant for drawing and writing. But there was nothing effeminate about him. In fact, once over his childhood ailments, Eddie, who physically took after his father, grew into a handsome and strapping young man of 6'2", with curly blonde hair and flirtatious blue eyes. He was athletic, became an equestrian, and a handyman. He enjoyed learning how things worked and discovered how to fix them when they stopped working. He had what you'd call a photographic mind, Eddie's brother Hank stated. Eddie was a walking encyclopedia, said his sister Estelle. You mentioned a word, and he'd tell you what it meant. I thought he'd swallowed a dictionary. Martha Stewart's brother, Frank Costyra, who was named after the paternal grandfather, firmly believed that all the children in the family, especially Martha, had inherited their father's mind power. We have a talent for looking at something just once, like watching someone bake a cake or lay bricks, and being able to do it right away. We could walk into someone's kitchen and smell something cooking on the stove and pretty much know what the ingredients were and go home and duplicate it. It's in the blood. It's in the genes. Okay. Maybe, but I never heard of that. I never heard of a photographic mind extending to be able to sniff a recipe and know what was in it without some kind of specific training, unless it was like a very simplistic recipe like a cheese toast. At Jersey City's William L. Dickinson High School, where his pals called him Curly, Eddie Costyra was the sole drum major for the marching band and sang with the glee club. following in his father's path, Kostara had taken up horseback riding and was accepted into an elite cavalry outfit, the Essex Troop, which had a reputation for smart appearance and high military standards on the order of Emperor Franz Joseph Honor Guard. When the troop was ordered to help quell a mob of angry strikers, Kostara was in the center of the action, and for years he kept a newspaper photo of himself in uniform on horseback, galloping after a frightened picket. In June 1929, Kostara graduated from Dickinson High with a general curriculum diploma. While there was no mention of any academic achievements in the yearbook, the Gnome, someone wrote, "Music hath its charms, especially when played by Ed, who was interested in almost every musical organization at school." Another yearbook photo noted, "The band will lose its tall, handsome drum major, Eddie Kostara, through graduation." From day one, the Kostara family saw great things for their Eddie, and there was talk about him becoming a doctor, a perfect profession for a young man who possessed a steel trap for a mind. But that was not to be. This is very strange to me. Apparently, according to everybody, he was like this genius who could do anything that he wanted to do. Nobody could stop him. He had this steel trap mind, a genius that bordered on the scary, but he took a different route from what he might have. A high school gym teacher had advised him that the future was physical education, not medicine. Kostara, who was a decent if unspectacular athlete, he entertained family and friends by balancing with one hand on a Coca-Cola box and juggling Indian clubs, took the teacher's advice. Of course, the gym teacher is going to tell you that that's the greatest profession. That's his profession. Not that there's anything wrong with being a gym teacher. Be a gym teacher, that's fine. But I don't know why he thought that being a gym teacher was going to be the door to all of his success. That seems irrational. But with money from his parents to cover an annual tuition of $275, $290 on his senior year, Kostara enrolled at a small school called the Panzer College of Physical Education and Hygiene in nearby East Orange. The school was in the business district in a 2-story building that had several classrooms, a laboratory, and a gymnasium. Since there was no campus, the students played outdoor sports in a nearby public park. When Kostara enrolled, Panzer offered 3 years of training, but it became a 4-year college when he was a junior, allowing him to earn a bachelor's degree in physical education. Granted, Panzer wasn't the Harvard School of Medicine, and Helen Kostara's boy genius wouldn't be performing brain surgery as she had dreamed, but he was the first Kostara to earn a college degree. At the height of the Depression, Kostara seemed to be living the life of a rich college boy, riding horses, playing tennis, and driving to school in a new Ford Model A Roadster with a rumble seat that his father bought him at the insistence of his doting mother. Eddie had promised his father that he'd earn part of his keep by using the car to deliver telegrams for Western Union, but he usually had more pleasurable pursuits. So he found an out. Eddie would go pick up the telegrams, Frank Kostara said with a chuckle, but I'd wind up delivering them. At Panzer, Kostara's reputation as a bookworm continued. Everything he read he took in that brain of his brother said. In college, he had to draw pictures of the torso, the muscles, and hell, they looked better than photographs. Besides his studies, he had a real artistic ability. Those drawings also underscored Kostara's perfectionism and his obsession with detail, both success-oriented habits that failed him, but were passed on to Martha, who used them with great success. While Kostara's aesthetic side was highly visible in his work at Panzer, his athletic abilities didn't shine on the playing field. And he just wasn't much of an athlete, remembered classmate Hazel Wacker. He had more artistic traits. We took English, sociology, psychology, and he liked those kinds of things more. We had basketball and baseball and soccer teams, but he never went out for those. The whole time Eddie was there, the only team he was on was track, and he was a member of the badminton club. He wasn't a strong athlete. He's more of a scholar and a dreamer. Which makes it all the more strange to me that he chose to become a physical education teacher. That just seems so contrary to everything about him. And I also want to say, too, his family, they were doing fine for themselves. For him to be living this life of sort of the rich college student riding horses, playing tennis, driving his car around, I think that the way his life started out, he had reached his peak by this point. And in his mind and in his estimation, life was going to go downhill pretty severely after this. But I just sometimes wonder, while I think he was really good at putting all of his attention and energy into certain things, like, say, drawings for his anatomy class, I don't feel like he knew how to put his work ethic to putting bread on the table. He is never going to be a success in life. Martha Stewart has said this in interviews before, that her father was very, very good at specific things and like getting into the minutia of a certain hobby of his, but he couldn't seem to put that work ethic to aid his family. To continue, to broaden his horizons, Kosira decided that a European trip was mandatory for his education. With his father picking up the tab once again at his mother's insistence, young Kosira spent a summer break touring the continent, a luxury unheard of at the peak of the Depression, when millions of American families were on the relief rolls. Kosira returned home with hundreds of snapshots of his odyssey abroad. Photography was one of his passions, and with a doozer of a story. He said that he met the King of Sweden, and that the king had invited him to play tennis, Hank Kosira recalled. Eddie told us he was beating the king, and that during a break in the match, they told my brother it was customary for the king to win. So Eddie let him win. Kosira's tale of the royal tennis match, undoubtedly embellished if not made up out of whole cloth, underscored his penchant for exaggeration, another facet of his personality that Martha Stewart inherited. In 1933, Kosira was among about a dozen Panzer students who were the first to graduate from the college with a bachelor degree in physical education. His yearbook picture showed a handsome, serious young man in a three-piece suit. The caption, written by the yearbook staff, read, "The race is not always to the swift. Time reckons with all men. Eddie started slowly, but there is that indescribable idealistic air about him that makes it almost impossible to know where his accomplishments match his artistic leanings. Such a man bears watching." Well, what of his marriage to Martha's mother? Let's read about that. I just want you to remember what we read about his childhood. His family is living fine during the Depression. His father knows how to make money. His father is buddy-buddy with the crooked mayor of the town, so he's getting all kinds of perks and benefits from that. He has enough money to buy his son a car. He is sending his son on a European vacation paid for by his father. He didn't have to work to earn that. His mother's constantly in his father's ear, "Give Eddie the next prize, the next prize, the next prize. Eddie's my perfect angel, my perfect boy. He can do no wrong." He was living a very plush life, and he had no dose of reality whatsoever. It's why I feel like he didn't feel really driven to do more than go to that sort of startup school for becoming a PE teacher, because I don't really feel like he'd had to struggle for much in his life. So I feel like he didn't necessarily feel that he needed to set himself up for success in the future. All right, this next chapter is called Finding a Mate. By the time Eddie Kosira met Martha Ruskowski, his bride-to-be, at that summer of 1937 Polish Heritage Seminar in Pennsylvania, he'd been working as a gym teacher in the Jersey City public school system for several years. Bleak. Not many other Panzer graduates could make that claim, it still being the Depression. Kosira's college classmate Hazel Wacker, for one, recalled, "There weren't an awful lot of jobs available for us. I didn't have a real job for 3 years after I graduated." But Kosira didn't face bleak unemployment like others. Right out of Panzer, he landed a teaching job because of his father's pull at City Hall. But spending 8 hours a day instructing sweaty adolescents on how to climb ropes and hang from rings without falling on their heads wasn't Kosira's idea of career heaven. He had come to the realization that his high school gym teacher had given him a bum steer. Kosira wanted bigger things for himself. At night, he took college credit courses in a variety of subjects, hoping to move into a more lucrative and interesting career. He saw himself as a man of many talents and with a great future. But Martha Ruskowski's unplanned pregnancy and their sudden marriage stopped him dead in his tracks. Eddie tried to make the best of a bad situation. They both did, observed a Kosira family member. But Eddie had a lot of resentment in him. He felt his life was over before it had really started. Eddie's dreams were definitely shattered, and it made him a bitter and angry man through much of his life. Martha Sr. wasn't really happy either. She'd wanted to teach and not jump into marriage and have kids right away, but she was able to handle life's slings and arrows more realistically than Eddie. He always had those visions of greatness, and he possessed that inflated ego, and it always got in his way. Unlike the Kosiras, the Ruskowskis were not entrepreneurial. As one Ruskowski family member observed, Eddie's father had his own business, and Martha's father was a laborer, but everybody worked hard. There really wasn't that much difference between both families. Martha's parents, Joe Ruskowski and Francisca Albeniak, were of the farming class. They had come to America before World War I from towns near Warsaw and Lublin, where the Albaniaks were fortunate to own a small parcel of land, and Rosowski's father was believed to have been the burgomaster of a tiny village. Actually, our parents lived fairly close in Poland, but they didn't know each other until they came to this country, said Clementine Rosowski Carrier, Martha Sr.'s younger sister. Father came to this country because he was scheduled to go into the Russian army, and he did not want to do this because there was so much hatred between the Russians and the Poles. Joe Rosowski, who had left behind a younger brother, knowing that he would be excused from military service because he was the family's sole surviving son, settled in Buffalo, New York's large Polish community, where he knew someone from his hometown. Arrangements had been made by the Albaniaks for Francisca to move to the community of Perry, New York, where a job was supposed to have been waiting for her. But when she arrived, there was no work, so she too migrated to Buffalo, where she found menial labor. They didn't know English, other than a few words, Carrier said of her parents. They met when both of them moved into the same boarding house. My mother was supposed to have been there for only a year, but then she met my father and decided to stay permanently. Joe Rosowski became an iron worker, a job he held for the rest of his life. Between 1914 and 1925, his wife brought 4 children into the world, 2 girls and 2 boys. The firstborn, named Martha, would be Martha Stewart's mother. All the children were raised in a 2-story wood-frame single-family house at 42 Guilford Street, on Buffalo's predominantly Polish East Side. We always had tenants, either upstairs or downstairs from us, Carrier said. Because of the Rosowskis' poor circumstances, Frances worked as a seamstress in her spare time to bring in extra money, and she taught her daughters how to make their own clothing. Martha became skilled at dressmaking and sewing, a talent she passed on to her namesake. Years later, Martha Kostyra wrote to her son Frank and told him of the hardships she had endured. She talked about her early childhood, growing up with nothing, sharing a bedroom with her sister and the 2 brothers sharing another bedroom. The house had central heat, 1 coal stove in the center. She grew up with nothing, and the first time she had something was when my parents married. The Rosowskis had scrimped and saved for their children's education. One son became a lawyer, another an engineer, and Martha got a teaching degree. She was scheduled to welcome her first class in September 1937 in the town of Slogan, New York, but that was before she became pregnant and eloped with Eddie Kostyra. Despite the fact that her life had suddenly become turned upside down, Martha fulfilled the teaching contract she signed, working while pregnant. She then moved to Jersey City, where she and her husband rented the little apartment on Stagg Street where Eric was born. Several years later, Martha came along, and then the others, 6 children in all. It was boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, family members said. With a growing brood to care for, Martha Rosowski Kostyra's dream of a teaching career went up in smoke. She did not return to the classroom until the last child, Laura, was in kindergarten in the early 60s. On a lazy Sunday morning in December 1941, 4 months after Martha's birth, America entered World War II, when the Japanese attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Soon, tens of thousands of able-bodied men were enlisted and being drafted every day to serve in the armed forces. Among those going off to fight was the Essex Troop, of which Eddie Kostyra had been a proud member. On April 6, 1942, the unit became a fully mechanized armored cavalry regiment, and it did valiant battle in the European theater. Eddie Kostyra's brother Hank enlisted in the Navy and served from 1943 to 1946 as an aviation machine specialist. But somehow, Martha's father was able to remain at home. The way Hank Kostyra remembered the situation, his brother avoided conscription because of, quote, the kids, and because he was a teacher. But through most of the war, the Kostyras had only 2 children. It was odd that Kostyra avoided the draft, since millions of healthy men with small families like his were called to bear arms. Frank Kostyra, Eddie's second son, the third of the children, who was born on February 3, 1945, about 6 months before the war ended, said, "When I asked Dad what he did in the war, he said that he was in the cavalry, and it was his duty to patrol. He said, some went, some didn't, I was chosen not to go." But it was never very explicit about why he didn't go overseas. In any case, Kostyra did serve his country on the home front, working at the Federal Shipyard and Dry Dock in nearby Kearney. When he started there, Eddie told me he made suggestions to his supervisor for speeding up production, Hank Kostyra said. Ed said the supervisor asked him, "Well, how the hell do you know that? Are you a college graduate or something?" My brother said, "Well, I happen to have several degrees." And so they took his suggestions and they made him superintendent of outfitting and rigging. Ed told me he was able to get the destroyer escorts out way ahead of schedule. He said he even took the ships on test runs to look for problems. I'll bet. The senior Kostyras, Frank and Helen, continued to operate their tavern through the war years. but the patriarch's death from pneumonia the day after Christmas 1943 turned the family's world upside down. All the Kostyras had relied on his strength and support, and now he was gone. He died without leaving a will. Letters of administration valued his estate at $2,500. After her husband's death, Helen Kostyra, then 63, tried to make a go of running the tavern herself. Mom took it over for a couple of years, Hank Kostyra said. It was nothing but hardship, because if you don't keep the family in it, you get robbed to death. I caught one of the workers carrying out a bundle of garbage, and I looked in it, and it was full of bottles of booze. So it didn't pay to run it anymore. It's just too much for her. The widow moved in permanently with her daughter Estelle, who was now married and living a few blocks from the family tavern. Estelle was to support her mother for the rest of her life, a sensitive issue that caused dissension between her and her brother Eddie for years to come. Meanwhile, Eddie and Martha Kostyra had 2 children and a third on the way, and had decided that they wanted to leave the growing urban plight of Jersey City and move out to the suburbs, where the air was fresh and the grass green, where he could have a garden. With the down payment given to him by his devoted mother, Kostyra bought an asbestos-sided 2-story, 3-bedroom, 1-bath Depression-era house with a full basement, a small sunroom, a tiny sewing room, and an unfinished attic for $8,000. Martha had just turned 3 that fall of 1944 when the moving van pulled up in front of 86 Elm Place in the town of Nutley, a quiet and pleasant community, a short bus ride from Manhattan. Cowgirl Annie Oakley had once been a resident. Mark Twain used to summer there, and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis' father's family, the Bouviers, once owned a house there. The town was known for its gracious parks, good schools, and the development of the anti-anxiety drugs, Valium and Librium. Today, its claim to fame is that it's the place where Martha Stewart grew up. So that is going to set up for our next reading. The next chapter is entitled Dysfunctional Family. Nobody can recall Martha Stewart's home as being a happy place. All of her friends were like, get in, get out, don't stay at Martha's. And it's a dark, depressing place. And it doesn't surprise me that Martha, through later years, wanted to embellish where she came from, because it would have been much nicer, the childhood she describes, than the one that she really had. But this is not the kind of home that you would enjoy being in. This was one in which you walked on eggshells, you tried not to bug your dad, you tried not to make your mom mad. It's just a place that would have made for austere children. And so when you see Martha Stewart's sort of like arm out mannerism, it kind of makes sense after finding out where she really lived and where she really came from. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. Thank you for listening to the reading. And the next time we come together, we'll be doing a dysfunctional family. We'll be talking about school days for Martha, puberty and privacy, and what it was like growing up in a small home with 5 other siblings. And there was just a lot that she was trying to bear up under. She's incredibly responsible, incredibly smart. But it is interesting because, well, she was so many things that were so good. It seems like she even felt the necessity to embellish upon her grades, her ambition, all these things that are true of her. She always had to make it better in her retelling. So it's very interesting to compare what she says happened with what other people are recalling about that same time period. The next couple of chapters are going to be heavy on comparisons between what Martha says happened and what her friends and family recall having happened. So it's really an intensely interesting study on the things that she felt the necessity to embellish. She's very much like her grandfather and her father before her, who would really embroider the truth and sometimes just make it up completely. And I just find it incredibly interesting, the part of her past that she feels she has to either completely make up or be very evasive about. So I hope you guys will find that as equally interesting as I did, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know that it was about her family, and so sometimes those background family chapters are not as interesting, but I do think it's really important to sort of set up the foundation for where she's coming from. These were stern people that she grew up with, and they were stern for a reason. They had to be, but also there was just kind of a roughness and a meanness to their nature that Eddie really embodies. Eddie was a spoiled boy growing up, who was told that, everything he laid his hand on would turn to gold, and when it didn't, he blamed everyone around him instead of being like, where's my work ethic? I think it's incredibly interesting that while it would appear that he had the mental ability to become something more than a gym teacher, he did not pursue it. And then when everybody else was going off to war, he was one of the few able-bodied men that somehow found a way to finagle his stay at home. And I just wonder, why did he not push himself? Why was he constantly setting himself up to failure? It's almost like he didn't want to reach his full potential. He didn't try to reach his full potential, so that he could never say to himself, well, I gave it my best go and I still failed. It's like he would not give it his best go, but then he could be mad that it failed. It's everybody else's fault, but it's like, were you trying? And he knows that he wasn't. But he's afraid that if he does try and he fails, then what? So he's a very interesting study. And I think he had a major influence on who Martha Stewart became. Everyone says they were very similar, but she seems to have the drive and ambition to test out what she was capable of, whereas he always sat in the background and claimed he could do the big, great things, but then never did. Very, very, very interesting. All right, I'll see you guys again soon. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.